Before anything else, a very quick thank you. This story came to us from the Sleepy Koala Army, and if you suggested this one, you already know who you are. Thank you. This community never stops surprising me with the depth and the curiosity of the topics you bring forward, and tonight's story is one of the most layered and genuinely fascinating ones we have tackled. So this one is for you. If you're listening to Sleep Theories on Spotify right now, please take 10 seconds to leave us a review. It takes almost no time at all, it costs nothing, and it genuinely means the world to this channel. Reviews help new listeners find their way here. They help this community grow, and they remind me that the hours and hours I pour into every single script are worth every late night. So if you enjoy what we do here, if this channel has ever helped you drift off, ever made a long night feel a little less heavy, please leave a review. It would mean so much. And now, let us begin, somewhere in the city of Los Angeles on a warm June afternoon in 2009, a man who had spent his entire life performing for the world took his last breath in private. There were no cameras, there was no audience. There were only a handful of people in a rented mansion in Holmby Hills, and paramedics who arrived too late, and a silence that spread outward from that house and across the entire planet within hours. Michael Jackson was 50 years old. He had been preparing for what many believed would be the greatest comeback in the history of popular music. He had been rehearsing 6 days a week. He had been charming audiences during production meetings and melting the hearts of everyone in the rehearsal room with flashes of his old brilliance. He was, by all visible accounts, on the edge of reclaiming something enormous. And then he was gone. What followed was one of the most extraordinary financial transformations in the history of entertainment. Within weeks of his death, record sales that had stagnated for years exploded overnight. Within months, a film assembled from rehearsal footage became one of the highest-grossing documentaries ever released. Within a few years, his estate had generated more money than most people could conceive of in a lifetime, far more than almost any analyst had projected he would earn, even if the comeback tour had gone perfectly. For the majority of the world, the story of Michael Jackson's death is a tragedy about addiction, medical negligence, and the crushing weight of fame. It is a story about a man who could not sleep, who trusted the wrong doctor, and who paid for that trust with his life. But for a smaller, quieter group of researchers, journalists, and observers, the story raises questions that have never been fully answered. Questions not about who administered the drug that killed him, because that part was settled in a court of law, but about the architecture surrounding his life in those final years, the network of contracts, the insurance policies, the catalogue of music that was quietly worth more than most governments wanted to admit. The question of who ultimately benefited, financially and structurally, from the death of the most famous entertainer who had ever lived. Tonight, we are going to follow that thread, carefully, factually, and with the understanding that asking questions is not the same as providing answers. This is the price of a king. Part 1. The Empire Behind the Entertainer. To understand what happened in 2009, you have to understand what Michael Jackson had built over the previous 3 decades. And most people, even people who consider themselves fans, do not fully understand it. Michael Jackson was not simply a musician. By the mid-1980s, he had become something more unusual, a one-man economic ecosystem. The revenue streams flowing through his career were so diverse and so large that they would have been impressive for a multinational corporation, let alone a single human being. He earned from record sales, of course. Thriller, released in 1982, would eventually become the best-selling album in the history of recorded music, a record it held for decades, and may still hold today depending on how you count it. The numbers involved are staggering. Over the course of its commercial life, Thriller has sold somewhere between 66 million and 100 million copies worldwide, depending on which industry source you consult. That single album generated royalty income that continued flowing for years after its release. But album royalties were only the beginning. Jackson earned from touring on a scale that few artists in any era have matched. The Bad World Tour of 1987 to 1989 grossed over $125 million and was attended by over 4 million people. The Dangerous World Tour of 1992 to 1993 reached over 60 countries and grossed approximately $100 million before Jackson cancelled it midway through due to his own health crisis. The History World Tour of 1996 to 1997 grossed over $165 million, making it one of the highest grossing tours in history at the time. He earned from merchandising. He earned from film projects, including his landmark work with John Landis on the Thriller music video, which was itself a cultural product that generated licensing income for years. He earned from television specials, from brand endorsements, from his Neverland Ranch, and from a range of licensing agreements that covered everything from his image rights to his name. And then there was the catalogue. In 1985, Michael Jackson did something that stunned the music industry and reordered the power relationships within it. He purchased the ATV music publishing catalogue for approximately $47.5 million. The ATV catalogue contained the publishing rights to approximately 4,000 songs. Among those 4,000 songs were the majority of the Beatles catalogue, including masterpieces like Hey Jude, Let It Be, Come Together, Yesterday, and hundreds of others that had been generating publishing income since the 1960s and showed no signs of stopping. Paul McCartney had reportedly advised Jackson to invest in music publishing years earlier, during a period when the two were friendly and recording together. What McCartney almost certainly did not anticipate was that Jackson would use that advice to purchase the very catalogue containing McCartney's own songs. The relationship between the two men became strained afterward and remained complicated for years, but the purchase was a masterstroke of business strategy, and it was entirely Jackson's own idea, driven by his own ambition and his own understanding of where real power in the music industry resided. It did not reside in performing. Performers came and went. Power resided in ownership, in publishing rights, in the contracts that determined who received money every single time a song was played on the radio, licensed for a film, used in a commercial, or covered by another artist. By purchasing the ATV catalogue, Jackson had positioned himself not merely as the most famous entertainer in the world, but as one of the most powerful intellectual property holders in the music business. He was, in a very real financial sense, competing with the corporations that ran the industry, rather than simply being an asset for them to profit from. In 1995, Jackson merged his ATV catalogue with Sony's music publishing holdings to create Sony/ATV Music Publishing, a joint venture that gave Sony a 50% stake and left Jackson with the other 50%. The combined entity was worth considerably more than either catalogue alone because it now controlled an enormous percentage of the most commercially valuable music ever recorded. The Sony/ATV catalogue would eventually grow to include hundreds of thousands of songs. Its value at the time of Jackson's death was estimated by various analysts to be somewhere between $1 billion and $2 billion. Some more aggressive estimates placed it higher. This is the financial reality that existed before any of the controversies, before the accusations, before the debts, before Conrad Murray. Michael Jackson had built something that was not just famous. It was genuinely, structurally powerful in ways that made him a different kind of player than almost anyone else in his industry. And that, some would argue, was precisely the problem. Part 2. The Decade of Destruction. The 1990s should have been a decade of consolidation for Michael Jackson. He had achieved more in the 1980s than almost anyone in the history of entertainment. He had the catalogue, he had the earnings, he had the global fan base. He had the infrastructure to sustain a career that could have run comfortably into the new millennium with his reputation and his finances intact. Instead, the 1990s became the decade that nearly destroyed him. The first allegations emerged in 1993. A 13-year-old boy named Jordan Chandler accused Jackson of sexual abuse. The accusations came through Jordan's father, Evan Chandler, a dentist who had become close to Jackson through his son's friendship with the star. Within days of the allegations becoming public, the story exploded across every major media outlet in the world. The coverage was extraordinary in its scale and its intensity. Television networks that might ordinarily have waited for legal proceedings to conclude instead ran the story continuously, with breathless updates, expert panels, and the kind of repetitive analysis that was designed less to inform than to hold eyeballs. Jackson was not convicted of anything. No! Criminal charges were filed. The case was settled in civil court, with Jackson reportedly paying somewhere between $20 million and $23 million to the Chandler family, a payment that his representatives characterized as a settlement made to avoid the disruption of continued litigation rather than an admission of guilt. But the damage to his public image was severe and immediate. Sponsors withdrew, tour dates were cancelled. His carefully constructed public persona, the image of a joyful, childlike figure who represented innocence and creativity and transcendent talent, was fractured in ways that proved extremely difficult to repair. Jackson himself was openly devastated. He gave a television interview in which he appeared emotional and defensive, and to many observers, genuinely confused about why the world had turned on him so completely. He struggled with pain medication addiction, which he has acknowledged. He cancelled a portion of his Dangerous World tour, citing health issues, and he retreated into a kind of public withdrawal, appearing less frequently and less predictably than before. It is worth pausing here to note something that the conspiracy-minded among Jackson's supporters have pointed to repeatedly in the years since his death. The 1993 allegations came at a specific moment in his career. They came after the ATV purchase. They came after the Sony/ATV joint venture was being structured. They came precisely as Jackson was at the peak of his commercial and financial leverage within the music industry. Whether that timing means anything is genuinely impossible to say with certainty. Accusations of abuse are extremely serious matters, and it would be wrong and irresponsible to dismiss them purely because their timing is convenient for a narrative about corporate power. Jackson was acquitted of all charges in the trial that eventually occurred in 2005. His supporters argue that the original allegations were financially motivated, pointing to the fact that Evan Chandler had reportedly expressed interest in having Jackson fund a film script before the allegations emerged. His critics argue that acquittals in criminal courts do not constitute proof of innocence. What is not in dispute is the effect on his career and his finances. By the late 1990s, Jackson's financial situation had become complicated in ways that were not immediately visible to the public. He had borrowed heavily against his share of the Sony/ATV catalogue in order to fund his lifestyle, including the maintenance of Neverland Ranch, which cost millions of dollars per year to operate. He had also invested in a range of business ventures, some of which did not perform as hoped. He had made loans and guarantees and payments that had accumulated into a debt load estimated at various times to be somewhere between $200 million and $500 million. The debt was not unmanageable, given the value of his assets. Sony/ATV was generating significant income and appreciating in value. His catalogue of his own music, separate from the ATV holdings, was also valuable. His name and image rights had commercial worth. On paper, Jackson was asset-rich, even if he was cash-poor by the standards of his own spending. But debt creates vulnerability. It creates pressure from lenders. It creates situations where the people who hold your debt have significant leverage over your decisions. And when the 2005 criminal trial arrived, that vulnerability became acute. The trial stemmed from allegations made by a family whose son had been befriended by Jackson in a manner similar to the previous case. Jackson was charged with 7 counts of child molestation and 2 counts of administering an intoxicating agent. The trial lasted several months and received wall-to-wall media coverage around the world. In June of 2005, the jury acquitted Jackson on all counts. But the trial had cost him enormously, not just financially, which the legal bills and the lost commercial opportunities were significant, but emotionally and reputationally. He left the United States after the verdict and moved to Bahrain with his children. He gave no concerts. He released no music. He appeared to the outside world to be a man who had been broken by the experience. His financial pressures, meanwhile, continued to mount. By 2006, some of his creditors were in serious discussions about the possibility of forcing a sale of his Sony/ATV stake. The prospect of that happening, of losing the crown jewel of his business empire, was something Jackson reportedly found deeply distressing. The clock was ticking. and somewhere in the back of his mind, Michael Jackson was already beginning to think about what a comeback might look like. Part 3. The architecture of AEG Anschutz Entertainment Group, known in the industry simply as AEG, is one of the largest entertainment companies in the world. It owns arenas, it promotes concerts, it manages venues, it has tentacles that reach through the entertainment business in ways that are not always visible from the outside, but are extremely significant on the inside. By 2008, AEG Live, the concert promotion arm of the parent company, had become interested in Michael Jackson. The reasons were obvious from a business perspective. Jackson had not toured in over a decade. His fan base, despite everything that had happened, remained enormous and genuinely passionate. A Jackson comeback, properly staged and marketed, had the potential to be one of the biggest concert events in history. The numbers were staggering even before a single ticket was sold. Negotiations between AEG and Jackson's representatives began taking shape in late 2008. The structure of the deal that eventually emerged was complex, as these things always are at this level of the entertainment industry. AEG would fund the production of the shows. They would advance significant money for rehearsals, for production costs, for Jackson's personal expenses during the preparation period. Jackson would perform. The revenues from ticket sales, merchandise, broadcasting rights and ancillary income would be divided according to agreements that ran to many pages of contractual language. There was also the matter of insurance. For a tour of this scale, with this level of financial investment, insurance was not optional. It was essential. AEG took out policies that would protect their investment in the event of various contingencies, including the possibility that the tour might not happen due to circumstances beyond their control. These policies were, from a business standpoint, entirely standard. Every large-scale concert tour of this nature involves similar coverage, but the existence of those policies means that Jackson's death, which occurred before a single show, had been performed, triggered significant insurance claims. How significant is difficult to say precisely, because the details of those claims have not been fully made public. But the general principle is well established. When a tour of this magnitude collapses before it begins, and when there are policies in place designed to protect the promoter's investment, the financial aftermath of that collapse can be substantial. AEG has consistently maintained that they acted appropriately throughout the entire process. They have argued that they did their due diligence on Jackson's health and capabilities. They have disputed various characterizations of their financial relationship with him. In subsequent litigation, brought by Jackson's mother Catherine against AEG, a jury ultimately found in favour of AEG, determining that Conrad Murray, though hired and paid by AEG, was acting as Jackson's personal physician, rather than as an agent of the company when he made the decisions that led to Jackson's death. That verdict closed the legal chapter of AEG's involvement. But it did not entirely quiet the questions that Jackson's supporters and some independent researchers have raised about the incentive structures at play in the months before his death. Those questions centre on a specific tension. AEG needed Jackson to perform. Their entire investment, which ran into tens of millions of dollars in advances and production costs, depended on him being able to deliver 50 shows at the O2 Arena in London. At the same time, Jackson was, by multiple accounts, struggling. He was not sleeping well. He was anxious about the tour. He was physically exhausted from rehearsals. He was dependent on substances to manage his insomnia and his anxiety. The question that lingers, not as an accusation but as a structural observation, is this. In that environment, was anyone truly prioritising Jackson's health over the financial pressure of the tour, or were the incentives so heavily weighted toward getting him on that stage that the signals of distress went unaddressed until it was too late? Conrad Murray would later say that he tried to wean Jackson off propofol during the rehearsal period, that he was aware of the danger, that he was doing his best in an impossible situation. The jury that convicted him of involuntary manslaughter clearly did not believe that his best was anywhere near sufficient. But Murray did not create the system that Jackson lived inside. He was one node in a much larger network, and the network, in its totality, had enormous financial reasons to keep Michael Jackson moving toward those 50 shows. Part 4. The catalogue and its consequences. There is one dimension of this story that receives less public attention than the others, perhaps because it requires more patience to understand, but which many researchers believe is actually the most important thread of all. It is the story of the Sony/ATV catalogue and what was happening to it in the years before Jackson died. By 2009, Sony/ATV music publishing was not simply valuable. It was one of the most valuable musical copyright portfolios on earth. It contained the Beatles catalogue, it contained songs by Bob Dylan, it contained Hank Williams, it contained Taylor Swift, whose early catalogue was held there. It contained tens of thousands of other songs that were generating licensing income from film, television, advertising, streaming, and radio every single day in virtually every country on earth. The combined estimated value of the Sony/ATV portfolio at the time of Jackson's death has been placed by various analysts at somewhere between $1 billion and $2.5 billion. Some of the more aggressive valuations, which accounted for the trajectory of digital music and streaming rights in the years ahead, suggested the portfolio would prove to be worth even more over time. History has validated that view. The catalogue has continued to appreciate significantly since 2009. Jackson owned 50% of Sony/ATV. Sony owned the other 50%. Their joint venture agreement governed how that ownership operated, how decisions were made, what happened in the event of various contingencies, and crucially, what would happen to Jackson's stake in the event of his death. The specific terms of those agreements are not entirely public. What is known is that after Jackson died, his 50% stake in Sony/ATV passed to his estate, and his estate eventually sold that stake to Sony in 2016 for approximately $750 million. That sale transformed the catalogue into wholly Sony-owned property and resolved what had been, from Sony's perspective, a complicated joint ownership structure that gave Jackson and his heirs significant leverage over an asset Sony clearly wanted to control completely. Now, the conspiracy-adjacent interpretation of this sequence of events goes something like this. Jackson, in the years before his death, had been exploring options for his Sony/ATV stake that did not involve simply leaving it in the existing joint venture structure. He had had conversations with potential investors and advisors about alternative structures. He had, by some accounts, been in discussions about ways to either buy out Sony's share or structure a deal that would give him greater operational control of the catalogue. If successful, such a restructuring would have given Jackson, or his heirs, even greater power over one of the world's most valuable musical copyright portfolios. Some observers suggest that this ambition, this desire to fully own and control the catalogue rather than share it with a corporate partner, put Jackson in direct tension with Sony's own interests, and they suggest that Sony had both the motive and the means to prefer a future in which Jackson's stake could be purchased cleanly from an estate rather than negotiated with a living, legally competent and financially ambitious Jackson himself. To be absolutely clear, there is no documented evidence of any deliberate wrongdoing by Sony in connection with Jackson's death. The official investigation found no such evidence. No credible legal or criminal proceeding has suggested it. The theory is exactly that, a theory, one constructed from inference and circumstantial observation rather than proof. But the question that the theory raises is not entirely without merit as a structural observation. The death of Michael Jackson did, in the long run, simplify the ownership situation of the Sony/ATV catalogue enormously. It transformed a complicated joint venture involving a legendarily difficult and independently powerful partner into an asset that Sony could eventually purchase outright from a cooperative estate structure. Whether that simplification was anticipated by anyone, whether it was desired by anyone, whether it influenced any decisions made during Jackson's final months, these are questions that no official investigation has fully answered. And the absence of an answer, for those inclined to ask the question, is itself a kind of answer. Part 5. Conrad Murray and the Question of Medical Judgment. Conrad Murray was a cardiologist. He was not a sleep specialist. He was not an anesthesiologist. He was not trained in the administration of propofol outside of a hospital setting, and indeed almost no physician in the world would be. because propofol is not a medication that is designed for use outside of clinical environments with full anaesthetic support, monitoring equipment, and resuscitation capabilities standing by. Propofol is a powerful intravenous anaesthetic that works with extraordinary speed. It induces unconsciousness within seconds. It also suppresses the breathing reflex, which means that a patient receiving it must be continuously monitored and, in many cases, assisted with breathing. Without that monitoring, without those safeguards, a patient receiving propofol can stop breathing and die before anyone realizes what is happening. This is not obscure medical knowledge. This is the first thing any physician learns about propofol. It is one of the most fundamental facts about the drug. Conrad Murray administered propofol to Michael Jackson in a bedroom in a rented mansion with no monitoring equipment, no resuscitation equipment, and on the morning of June 25, 2009, with Murray himself temporarily absent from the room. When Murray returned and found Jackson unresponsive, he attempted resuscitation on a bed rather than the floor, which emergency medicine protocols identify as significantly less effective, and he waited an extraordinary amount of time before calling emergency services. The prosecution in Murray's involuntary manslaughter trial argued that these facts represented a pattern of such egregious negligence that criminal liability was warranted. The jury agreed, and Murray was convicted and served approximately 2 years in prison before being released on probation. Murray's own defence, and his subsequent statements after his release, have consistently maintained that he was doing his best to help a patient who was desperately dependent on propofol and who had been using it prior to Murray's involvement. He has argued that he was trapped by Jackson's own needs and by the pressures of the tour infrastructure surrounding them both. He has suggested, without always saying so directly, that he was not the only person responsible for the environment that led to Jackson's death. Some supporters of the conspiracy interpretation of events have pointed to several aspects of Murray's situation that they find significant. First, Murray was hired and paid not by Jackson directly, but by AEG Live. His monthly salary for the duration of the tour was reportedly $150,000, a figure that represented a substantial improvement on his previous income. He had significant financial incentive to keep his employer, AEG, satisfied and to keep the tour moving forward. Second, Murray had personal financial difficulties before taking the position. He had multiple child support obligations, credit problems, and practice-related financial pressures. His financial need made him, in the view of some observers, more susceptible to pressure from the powerful interests that surrounded the tour. Third, the timeline of events on the morning of Jackson's death contains gaps and inconsistencies that Murray himself has offered different accounts of over the years. The precise sequence of when he administered the final dose of propofol, when he last checked on Jackson, when he realised Jackson was in distress, and when he finally called emergency services has never been entirely consistent across all his statements. None of these observations necessarily changes the essential legal finding. Murray was convicted. His conviction was upheld on appeal. The criminal case against him is closed. But the question of whether Murray was the only relevant actor, or whether he was the most visible and most prosecutable actor within a much larger system of pressures and incentives that contributed to the conditions of Jackson's death, is one that the criminal trial was never designed to fully answer. Criminal trials answer a narrow question. Did this specific person commit this specific crime? They are not designed to examine the systemic conditions that created the environment in which the crime occurred, and the systemic conditions surrounding Michael Jackson in the spring and early summer of 2009 were, by almost any account, extreme. Part 6. The Posthumous Billion. In the fiscal year 2016, according to Forbes magazine's annual list of highest-earning dead celebrities, Michael Jackson's estate generated $825 million in a single year, 7 years after his death. That number is almost incomprehensible. It exceeded the annual earnings of many Fortune 500 companies. It was generated by the estate of a man who had been dead for the better part of a decade. The sources of that income were multiple and interlocking. The sale of the Sony/ATV stake, which closed in 2016 for approximately $750 million, accounts for much of that particular year's figure. But even in years without a transaction of that magnitude, Jackson's estate has consistently generated revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars. His music continues to sell. His catalogue of recordings, separate from the publishing catalogue he once owned, continues to generate streaming income, download income, and licensing income. His image rights are licensed for merchandise, for advertising, for commercial projects around the world. His name is associated with continuing ventures in theatre, in Las Vegas entertainment, in film and television. The Cirque du Soleil production built around his music ran for years and generated significant revenues. The This Is It concert documentary, assembled from rehearsal footage filmed in the weeks before his death, earned over $250 million at the global box office, making it one of the most successful music documentaries in film history. The contrast with his earning situation in the final years of his life is striking. Jackson had been struggling financially for most of the 2000s. His debt load was substantial. He was not releasing new music that was commercially performing at the level of his earlier work. His most recent studio album, Invincible from 2001, had been a commercial disappointment relative to his earlier releases, though it still sold millions of copies. His tours had become infrequent and complicated. He was, by the standards of his own previous commercial trajectory, in decline. His planned comeback tour, This Is It, was the mechanism by which he hoped to reverse that decline. The 50 London shows were projected to gross somewhere between $350 million and $400 million in ticket revenue alone, before accounting for merchandise, broadcasting rights, or the documentary potential. If successful, the tour would have given Jackson the financial breathing room to restructure his debt, potentially regain full control of his Sony/ATV stake, and establish himself as a commercially relevant artist again in an era dominated by very different kinds of music. But he died before any of it happened. And what followed was something that no financial model had fully anticipated. The outpouring of grief around the world created a demand for Jackson's music and his image that exceeded what any living comeback could have produced. There is a phenomenon in the entertainment industry, sometimes called the death premium, by which the death of a beloved artist creates a sudden, intense surge in demand for their work, followed by a sustained elevation in their cultural status that can last indefinitely. Jackson's death premium was the largest in the history of popular music. The numbers speak for themselves. In the days immediately following his death, his music occupied approximately 10 of the top 20 positions on the iTunes global chart simultaneously. His estate, managed initially by John Branca and John McClane, moved quickly and skillfully to capitalise on that demand with a series of well-executed releases, projects and licensing agreements that sustained the financial momentum far beyond the initial surge. Was this outcome anticipated by anyone? Was it planned for? The answer to the first question is almost certainly that sophisticated financial actors understood, at least in general terms, that the death of Michael Jackson would produce significant posthumous commercial activity. Any competent analyst of the music industry would have understood that. Whether anyone specifically anticipated the scale of what actually happened is another matter entirely. And the answer to the second question, whether it was planned for in the specific sense of being a desired outcome that motivated any particular actions, is something that no investigation has found evidence for, and that responsible observers are careful not to assert without evidence. But the question exists, and the numbers that underlie it are real. Part 7. The Theories and Their Limits. The internet in the years following Jackson's death became a repository for theories about what had really happened to him. Some of those theories were straightforward extensions of the factual record, emphasising corporate pressure and financial incentive in ways that were reasonable if unproven. Others veered into territory that was increasingly difficult to take seriously, involving elaborate claims about deliberate assassination, about powerful cabals orchestrating his death, about faked deaths and hidden lives, about levels of conspiracy so broad and so deep that they would have required the silent cooperation of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. It is important to distinguish between these categories of claim, because conflating them does a disservice both to honest inquiry and to the genuine complexities of Jackson's situation. The credible questions, the ones that deserve to be taken seriously, are structural ones. They ask not whether shadowy figures gathered in a room and decided to have Michael Jackson killed, but whether the system of incentives and pressures surrounding him was designed in ways that prioritised financial outcomes over his well-being, whether the people responsible for his care, both medical and managerial, were adequately motivated to protect him, even when protecting him might have meant acknowledging problems that would have delayed or cancelled the tour, whether the corporate structures that stood to benefit from certain outcomes related to his catalogue and his estate had, intentionally or not, created conditions that made those outcomes more likely. These are legitimate questions. They are the kind of questions that critical journalism, regulatory oversight, and legal proceedings are supposed to investigate. Some of those questions were addressed in the Murray trial and in the subsequent AEG litigation. Others were not. The less credible theories, the ones that posit direct, deliberate conspiracy to commit murder, face an almost insurmountable evidentiary problem. There is no evidence for them, not absence of disproof, but genuine absence of any credible evidence pointing in that direction. The official investigations conducted by the Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, and subsequently by prosecutors, found no such evidence. The civil litigation brought by Jackson's family found no such evidence sufficient to prevail in court. No credible whistleblower has emerged in the years since with evidence of deliberate planning. The absence of evidence is not proof of innocence in every context, and in situations where evidence might have been suppressed or destroyed, its absence means less than in ordinary cases. But it is also not reasonable to simply assume, without evidence, that the most extreme version of a theory is true. What is reasonable, and what the factual record clearly supports, is a more modest but still troubling conclusion: that the system surrounding Michael Jackson in his final months was not primarily organised around his health or his well-being. It was organised around money, around the tour, around the obligations and the investments and the contracts that had already been signed, and that system, whatever its individual actors may have intended, failed to protect a man who needed protection. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is an observation about how large-scale commercial entertainment operates, and it is an observation that should be deeply uncomfortable for anyone who cares about the human beings whose creativity drives that industry. Part 8. The fans who kept asking. There is something that deserves acknowledgement here, something that gets lost in discussions of Jackson that focus either on his artistry or on the controversies that shadowed him. The people who have kept asking these financial and structural questions about his death have not, for the most part, been crackpots or professional conspiracy theorists. They have been, in many cases, people who loved his music deeply and who felt that the story they were being told did not quite cohere. They noticed that the timeline of controversies in his life tracked strangely with the timeline of his business dealings. They noticed that the most powerful corporation in his financial life benefited enormously from his death in ways that they did not appear likely to benefit from his continued living. They noticed that the man convicted of his killing was, by any honest assessment, a relatively small figure in the vast machinery that surrounded him, and that the verdict against Murray seemed to settle the legal question while leaving larger structural questions untouched. They are not wrong to notice these things. Noticing is not the same as concluding. Observing a pattern is not the same as proving causation. But in a culture that often dismisses grief-driven inquiry as mere conspiracy thinking, it is worth acknowledging that sometimes the people who keep asking uncomfortable questions are asking them for reasons that deserve respect. Michael Jackson spent his entire life being misrepresented, misunderstood, and manipulated by powerful interests. His image was constructed and then deconstructed by forces he never fully controlled. His finances were managed and mismanaged and leveraged and encumbered by structures that served others as often as they served him. His health was treated as a logistical problem to be managed rather than a fundamental concern to be addressed. The people who look at all of that and ask whether the ending too might have been shaped by forces beyond his own individual tragedy, they are not necessarily wrong to ask. They may be wrong about the specific answers. but the instinct to look at the full picture of power and money and corporate interests surrounding his life, and to refuse to accept the simplest available explanation without question, that instinct has a long and respectable history in critical inquiry. It is the same instinct that drives good journalism, good history, and good science. The willingness to say, I understand what I have been told, but I want to understand what I have not been told. Part 9. What the rehearsal showed. In 2009, Kenny Ortega was the creative director of the This Is It tour. He had worked with Jackson before and was one of the people who knew him best in a professional context. During the weeks of rehearsal at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, Ortega both observed and documented what was happening. The footage that emerged from those rehearsals and that was subsequently assembled into the Michael Jackson's This Is It concert documentary showed something extraordinary. It showed a man who, when he was on that stage, when the music was playing and the lights were on and the dancers were around him, was unmistakably still Michael Jackson. The movement was there, the instinct was there, the charisma was there. Moments of the rehearsal footage are genuinely electrifying, not as nostalgia but as evidence of a performer who had not lost the fundamental thing that made him singular. But there were also concerning moments. There were days when Jackson appeared frail, when he seemed cold despite the temperature, when his energy seemed to drop in ways that alarmed the people around him. There were incidents during the rehearsal period that caused Ortega and others to raise concerns about whether Jackson was ready to perform 50 shows in London. There were communications between AEG personnel and Ortega and Jackson's team that, when they later became part of the legal record in the AEG litigation, revealed an awareness among multiple parties that something was not quite right. One email, written by Ortega to AEG's Randy Phillips on a June night in 2009, expressed concern about Jackson's condition and asked whether it might be appropriate to bring in outside medical or psychological support. The response from the AEG side was, in the view of some observers, more focused on getting Jackson back to rehearsal than on addressing the underlying concern. The court ultimately determined that this response did not constitute legal negligence sufficient to make AEG liable for Jackson's death, but it illustrates the environment in which he was living in his final weeks. The environment of a massive, expensive, contractually committed production, machine that needed him to function, and that responded to signs of his struggling by focusing on the path back to functionality, rather than the path toward genuine care. There is a famous piece of footage from the final full rehearsal Jackson participated in, shot the day before he died, in which he performed a version of Earth Song that was, by the account of everyone present, genuinely moving. The performers around him described being in tears. The crew described the feeling of being in the presence of something rare and irreplaceable. 24 hours later, he was dead. The brutality of that contrast, the gap between the man who could still conjure that kind of transcendence and the vulnerability that took his life the following morning, is the central tragedy of this story. Whatever theory you hold about the larger forces at play, whatever questions you ask about money and power and corporate interest, that human contrast remains at the centre. A man who had more talent than the industry deserved, whose life had been shaped and sometimes deformed by forces he could not fully control, who was trying to do one more extraordinary thing, and who did not live to do it. Part 10, The Legacy and the Unresolved. It has now been more than 15 years since Michael Jackson died. The world has continued to argue about him. His legacy is genuinely contested in ways that few artists of his stature have experienced. On one side are the accusations and the documentaries and the arguments that his behaviour with children was indefensible, regardless of his acquittal and his artistry. On the other side are his defenders, who argue that he was the victim of financially motivated accusations, a biased media, and a cultural moment that found it convenient to destroy him. The debate about his character is important, and it is not one that this documentary is designed to resolve. What this documentary has been designed to do is something narrower, to trace the financial architecture of his life, to identify the structural tensions that existed between his interests and the interests of the corporations around him, and to ask honestly whether the story of his death is fully explained by the story of a negligent doctor. The answer, based on the factual record, is probably this: Conrad Murray's negligence was real, and it was lethal. The conviction was appropriate, but Murray did not create the conditions that led to a situation where an exhausted, insomniac, anxious 50-year-old man was being administered hospital-grade anaesthetics in a bedroom every night. Those conditions were created by a system that needed him to perform and that treated his health as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be protected. The financial story around his catalogue, around Sony/ATV, around the posthumous earnings and the estate, raises questions that are structurally valid even if they do not lead to provable conclusions about deliberate wrongdoing. The questions about who benefited from the specific form that his death took, as opposed to other possible outcomes such as a cancelled tour due to health reasons, or a tour that proceeded and generated revenue for him while he lived, are questions that deserve more systematic examination than they have received. 17 albums, 13 Grammy Awards, the best-selling album in the history of recorded music, over $1 billion generated by his estate in certain years after his death, a catalogue of publishing rights that may eventually prove to be worth several $1 billion in total, a career that shaped popular music for more than 4 decades, and whose influence is still audible in virtually every corner of contemporary music. That is the scale of what Michael Jackson was, and that scale, that extraordinary commercial and cultural power, did not exist separately from the structures and the pressures and the incentives that surrounded him throughout his life and that were pressing down on him most heavily in the months before he died. The official story says he died because his doctor made catastrophically bad decisions about his medical care. That is true. It is also insufficient in the sense that it answers the proximate cause without fully examining the distal conditions. The world that put Conrad Murray in that room, that created the pressures that created the environment, that built the financial architecture around a human being who needed rest and received instead an accelerating series of obligations and deadlines, that world deserves examination too. Michael Jackson was the price of a system that valued what he could produce more than it valued who he was. He was worth more as a catalogue than as a man. He was worth more as a posthumous brand than as a living, complicated, struggling human being who needed sleep and peace and genuine medical care. Whether that calculation was ever made consciously by any specific person or persons, we cannot say with certainty, but we can say that the calculation was implicit in the structure of everything that surrounded him, and the outcome was not an accident of medicine alone. It was in some larger sense the price that was paid for building an industry on the back of a single, irreplaceable human being, and then treating that human being as just another asset on the ledger. Epilogue. The last question. Tonight, wherever you are listening, whether it is 2 in the morning and the world is quiet around you, or 4 in the morning and you have been lying in the dark with thoughts that will not settle, I want you to sit with a specific image for a moment. It is a Tuesday night in June 2009 at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. The dancers are tired. The production crew is tired. Michael Jackson walks back out to center stage one more time, and the music comes up, and something in him responds to it the way it always has, the way it responded the first time he ever walked onto a stage as a little boy in Gary, Indiana, 60 years ago now and a world away. He is 50 years old. He has been through more than most people could survive. He is carrying debt and fear and the weight of 50 shows that begin in weeks. He is not sleeping. He is not well. He's surrounded by people who need something from him in ways that are not always distinguishable from love. And yet, when the music comes up, something moves. That thing, that response between a human being and their truest work, that is the thing that no contract can own. No catalogue can contain it. No estate can generate it. No posthumous brand can replicate it. It is the thing that was lost on June 25th, 2009, and it is the thing that all of the money and all of the transactions that followed cannot replace. The lawyers got the catalogue, the corporations got the rights, the estate got the earnings, and the world got to keep asking what might have been if the system that consumed Michael Jackson had just once decided that the human being mattered more than what he was worth. Sleep well tonight. You have been listening to Sleep Theories. Before we get into tonight's story, a quick thank you to Jeff Anon for sending in this video idea. If you have a story, a theory, a mystery, or something that has been keeping you up at night, drop it in the comments below. We read every single one, and your idea could be the next thing we cover here on Sleep Theories. Now, let us talk about a sound that should not exist. There is a sound you cannot explain. You have not heard it on any radio, in any concert hall, through any speaker system engineered by human hands. It does not travel through the air the way ordinary sound does. It does not bounce off walls or fade when you step inside. It follows you. It finds you in the deepest part of your home, in the basement, under the blankets, behind closed doors and sealed windows. It finds you at 2 a.m. when the rest of the world has gone quiet, and it sits inside your chest like the hum of a machine that was never meant to be heard. This is the story of Taos, New Mexico, a small city of roughly 17,000 souls, nestled against the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the desert air is cold and sharp and the stars at night burn with a clarity that makes you feel both small and infinite at once. It is a place of artists and veterans, of retirees who came for the quiet, of Native American communities who have called this landscape sacred for thousands of years. It is a place where the silence, at least until the early 1990s, was something you could count on. Then Harold Wexler heard something that changed everything. Harold was 61 years old in February of 1993. He had spent 32 years as a structural engineer, a man whose entire professional life had been devoted to understanding how things hold together, how materials behave under stress, how invisible forces move through solid matter. He was not, by any measure, an irrational man. He was precise. He was methodical. He had spent decades listening to the physical world with the practiced ear of someone who understood that structures speak, that bridges and buildings and deep foundations all produce sounds when forces move through them. So when Harold began hearing something in the middle of the night, he did not panic. He did not dismiss it as imagination. He did the thing that an engineer does. He investigated. He described the sound in his initial report to the Taos County Health Department as something resembling a diesel engine buried underground. Not a distant engine, not a truck passing on a highway miles away, but something beneath the earth itself. A low, rhythmic throb that pulsed in slow, steady intervals, strongest between 2 and 4 in the morning when traffic was non-existent and the natural world was at its most still. He said it felt as much as it sounded, a vibration he could feel in his sternum, in the bones of his jaw, in the fillings of his back teeth. He lost sleep over it. Then he lost more sleep. Then he began losing weeks. By April of 1993, Harold had contacted his doctor about chronic insomnia. By June, he had begun experiencing migraines of a severity he had never known before. He developed occasional nosebleeds, which he had never been prone to in his life. His wife noticed that he had become irritable and disoriented, that he sometimes seemed to lose track of conversations midway through them, as though something was pulling his attention inward toward a sound only he could perceive. And then, gradually, he realized he was not alone. The first person to come forward after Harold's story appeared in a small column in the Albuquerque Journal in the summer of 1993 was a woman named Patricia Sanchez, a retired schoolteacher who lived 4 miles from Harold and who had been experiencing the same phenomenon since January of that year. She described it in almost identical terms, a diesel engine underground, worst in the pre-dawn hours. She had assumed at first that she was hearing a neighbour's generator. When she discovered there was no generator, she assumed she was developing tinnitus. When her doctor confirmed her hearing was perfectly normal, she had no explanation left. She had simply been living with it, silently, convinced that no one would believe her. Then came Robert Caldera, a Vietnam veteran who had moved to Taos for the peace and quiet. Then came Marie Solis, a ceramics artist. Then came James and Donna Archuleta, who ranched on the mesa north of town. Then came an elderly Pueblo woman named Clara Mirabal, who said the sound had begun disturbing her community's ceremonial nights. the hours when the desert was supposed to be sacred and still. By the end of 1993, the Albuquerque Journal had received complaints from more than 60 residents across a 20-mile radius around Taos. The symptom profile was disturbingly consistent across all of them: insomnia, headaches, nosebleeds, cognitive fog, a creeping anxiety that was difficult to articulate but impossible to shake, and beneath all of it, that sound, that low, slow, grinding pulse from somewhere below the ground. The Taos hum, as it would come to be known in the local press, had been born. And so had the question that would haunt investigators, scientists, journalists, and federal officials for the next 3 decades. What exactly was making it? To understand what made the Taos hum so uniquely troubling, you need to understand where Taos sits on the map. Not just geographically, but strategically, historically, in terms of what the American government chose to build and test and hide in the New Mexico desert across the span of the 20th century. Draw a circle 150 miles in diameter around Taos, New Mexico. Inside that circle, you will find Los Alamos National Laboratory, one of the most classified and consequential scientific facilities in the history of human civilization, the place where the atomic bomb was born, where the physics of annihilation were worked out on chalkboards by brilliant and terrified men during the Second World War, and where weapons research has continued, quietly and largely out of public view, in the decades since. You will find Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, another crown jewel of the American nuclear weapons complex, responsible for the engineering and testing of nuclear warheads across generations of Cold War armament. You will find Kirtland Air Force Base, whose sprawling underground facilities include one of the largest nuclear weapons storage complexes in the United States, a network of bunkers and tunnels and hardened vaults that stretches beneath the desert for distances that are not publicly disclosed. You will find White Sands Missile Range, where the American military has tested everything from captured German V-2 rockets to modern precision weapons, where the first nuclear detonation in human history scorched the desert floor on July 16th, 1945, at a place called Trinity. You will find the highways and rail corridors that once carried nuclear materials, spent fuel rods, warhead components, and classified cargo across the southwest through the height of the Cold War, routes that were heavily secured, frequently travelled by convoy, and almost never discussed in public documents. You will find federal land exclusions, restricted airspace, boundary markers that tell you to turn back and provide no explanation for why. Taos sits at the centre of all of this. It always has. The residents who moved there for the beauty and the silence moved into a landscape that had been shaped, underground and out of sight, by decades of nuclear activity. They simply did not know it. When residents began pressing local officials for answers in late 1993 and into 1994, the response from state and federal authorities was measured, careful, and ultimately unsatisfying. Officials acknowledged that people were reporting a sound. They noted that similar low-frequency hum phenomena had been reported in other parts of the world, in Bristol, England, in Largs, Scotland, in Windsor, Ontario, and that in none of those cases had a definitive source been identified. They suggested that the Taos hum might be industrial in origin, perhaps related to natural gas drilling or pipeline activity in the region. They suggested it might be geological, the result of unusual seismic conditions in the area. They suggested, with the carefully neutral language of bureaucratic plausibility, that some portion of the reports might be psychosomatic, that sensitive individuals were, in essence, hearing themselves. The residents of Taos did not find any of this satisfying. Neither did their congressman. Bill Richardson was a Democrat representing New Mexico's 3rd Congressional District in 1997, and he was a man who understood political realities and constituent pressure in roughly equal measure. He had been hearing about the hum from his constituents for years by that point, and the complaints had not diminished. If anything, they had grown more urgent and more numerous. People were suffering. They were losing sleep, losing health, losing their sense of safety in their own homes. and the explanations they were receiving from officials ranged from insufficient to dismissive. Richardson did what congressmen do when they want answers and want them on record. He wrote letters. He made calls. He formally requested that several of the nation's most prestigious scientific institutions conduct a rigorous investigation into the source of the Taos hum and report their findings. The institutions that responded were formidable. Los Alamos National Laboratory sent acoustic specialists. Sandia National Laboratories contributed engineers with expertise in low-frequency vibration analysis. The University of New Mexico assembled a team from its acoustics research program. The investigation, at least on paper, was comprehensive. Equipment was deployed across the Taos area. Seismic sensors were planted in the earth. ELF detectors, devices capable of measuring extremely low-frequency electromagnetic and acoustic signals, were set up at multiple points across the region. Mobile sound triangulation rigs moved through the desert, trying to pinpoint a source, a direction, a point of origin for whatever was producing the phenomenon. The public conclusion, released in 1997, was 3 words that satisfied no one: no identifiable source. The scientists had not found the hum, or more precisely, they had not found a source they could publicly attribute it to. The official summary noted that approximately 2% of the population in the study area reported perceiving the phenomenon, that measurements taken during the investigation had failed to record any external acoustic source corresponding to witness descriptions, and that while several unusual readings had been obtained during the investigation period, none rose to the level of a conclusive finding. There was, however, a classified appendix to the investigation report. Its existence was acknowledged, but its contents were not disclosed. The appendix was sealed. What was in it? That question has never been answered to the satisfaction of anyone who has spent serious time studying the Taos hum. What is known, through partial disclosures, through leaked fragments, through the careful work of researchers who have filed Freedom of Information requests over the course of decades, is that at least one significant anomaly was recorded during the investigation and then removed from the public summary of findings. The anomaly was this: low-frequency pulses were detected below 40 Hz at the extreme lower boundary of human hearing, emanating from a depth that acoustic modelling placed at between 1.5 and 3 miles beneath the surface of the Earth. The signals were not random. They were not the signature of geological settling or seismic background noise. They were rhythmic. They pulsed with a regularity that suggested to the engineers who recorded them a mechanical rather than a natural origin. The report containing this finding was flagged for interagency review. It was removed from the public summary. The classified appendix was sealed. The hum continued. To understand how something like this could exist beneath the desert of northern New Mexico, you need to go back further. You need to go back to a morning in July of 1945, to a remote stretch of desert in southern New Mexico called the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead, where a tower stood in the pre-dawn darkness holding the most dangerous object in human history. At 5:29 in the morning on July 16th, 1945, the Trinity device detonated. The yield was approximately 21 kilotons. The flash was visible from Albuquerque, more than 200 miles away. The shockwave shattered windows in Silver City, 120 miles distant. A steel tower that had stood 60 feet tall was vaporized. The desert sand beneath the blast fused into a glassy green mineral that would later be called trinitite, and it exists in the desert to this day, a physical remnant of the moment humanity first split the atom with intent. But the explosion that everyone saw was not the only thing that happened at Trinity that morning. Something else happened, something that was not visible, that did not make newspaper headlines, that was not photographed or filmed or celebrated. The shockwave from the detonation drove deep into the earth, not just into the sand and rock at the surface, but into the layers below, through limestone formations and volcanic rock and fractured granite, down through the geological architecture of the region in ways that took years to fully understand and that, some researchers have come to believe, were never fully mapped. The Trinity detonation was the first, but it was far from the last. The decades that followed the end of the Second World War saw the American nuclear weapons program expand at a pace and scale that is difficult to comprehend from the vantage point of the present. The United States conducted more than 1,000 nuclear tests between 1945 and 1992. The Nevada test site northwest of Las Vegas hosted the majority of atmospheric and underground tests on American soil. But research, experimentation, and classified programs were distributed across the Southwest in ways that the public record still does not fully capture. Underground nuclear testing, which became the dominant method after the partial nuclear test ban, Treaty of 1963 prohibited atmospheric detonations, presented a problem that the weapons community had not fully anticipated. When you detonate a nuclear device underground, the energy does not disappear. It moves. It travels through rock and mineral and water table and geological fault in the form of seismic waves. Some of that energy dissipates within miles. Some of it travels much further. Some of it, in regions with particular geological characteristics, can resonate, can bounce between layers of different density, can create standing waves of vibration that persist long after the explosion that generated them. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, as underground testing became more frequent and more powerful, geologists and physicists working within the nuclear weapons complex began to notice something troubling. Certain areas of the Southwest appeared to be developing unusual subterranean acoustic signatures. Readings from monitoring equipment showed persistent low-frequency vibrations in regions that had received no recent test activity. The vibrations were weak. They were far below the threshold of human perception under normal circumstances. But they were there, and they were not going away, and their patterns suggested that something in the deep geology of the region had been permanently altered. A classified research initiative was launched in 1961 under a name that appeared in a single fragmentary, declassified document recovered by researchers in the early 2000s, the Subsurface Resonance Containment Initiative. Its internal code name, referenced in the same fragment, was Project Subterrane. The stated objectives of Project Subterrane, as they can be pieced together from partial disclosures and research conducted by independent analysts, were threefold. First, to study the long-term vibrational effects of underground nuclear testing on deep geological formations across the American Southwest. Second, to develop methods for preventing or mitigating tectonic destabilization that might result from the cumulative stress of repeated underground detonations. Third, and most significantly, to identify and suppress what the document called residual resonance signatures, the persistent low-frequency vibrations that had begun appearing in monitoring data across the region. The primary research hub for this initiative was Los Alamos. The facility had the computing power, the classified infrastructure, the deep earth monitoring networks, and the security architecture necessary to conduct this kind of work without public awareness. Teams of physicists, geologists, and acoustic engineers were assigned to the project. Funding was channeled through budget categories that gave no indication of the work's true nature. Project Subterrane continued, according to the partial record available, through at least the 1980s. What it found, and what it did with those findings, remains largely unknown, but what happened in and around Taos in the years that followed suggests that the project may have done considerably more than study the problem it was created to address. In the early 1970s, at the height of Cold War infrastructure expansion, several classified programs were developed within the nuclear weapons complex to address a problem that had become increasingly urgent: how to power remote and deeply classified facilities in ways that were not dependent on above-ground power grids that could be targeted, disrupted, or monitored by adversaries. The solution that several research teams converged on was elegant in concept and extraordinary in engineering ambition: a compact nuclear reactor designed not for power generation at scale but for deep earth installation could be drilled into the bedrock at depths of a mile or more, where it would be invisible from the surface, immune to conventional attack, and capable of generating continuous power for decades without refueling or significant maintenance. Its exhaust heat would dissipate into surrounding rock. Its operational signature would be minimal. At sufficient depth, it would be undetectable by any monitoring technology that a foreign adversary might reasonably deploy. This was not science fiction. The United States had been developing compact nuclear reactors for military applications since the 1950s. Snap reactors, systems for nuclear auxiliary power, had been built and deployed in satellites, in remote Arctic bases, aboard naval vessels. The engineering challenge of adapting this technology for deep Earth installation was formidable, but not, for the resources of the 1970s American defense establishment, insurmountable. Dr. Elias Mercer spent 11 years as a contractor at Sandia National Laboratories. He worked in acoustic engineering and vibration analysis, specifically in the context of underground facility design. He left Sandia in 1989 under circumstances that he has described as a matter of conscience. He did not speak publicly about his work for more than a decade. When he did speak, it was not through official channels and not on the record in any way that could be easily corroborated. But the account he provided to two independent researchers in the early 2000s was detailed, technically coherent, and consistent with what the fragmentary physical and documentary evidence suggests. According to Mercer, deep Earth nuclear reactors were installed at multiple points beneath the desert of northern New Mexico, beginning in the early 1970s. Their primary purpose was to provide power to classified underground facilities, including research installations, weapons storage complexes, and subterranean communication infrastructure. Secondary purposes included powering the seismic monitoring arrays that the nuclear weapons complex needed to track underground test activity, both its own and that of the Soviet Union. The reactor shafts, Mercer said, were drilled to depths of between 2 and 4 miles. The drilling was conducted by specialised teams whose records were classified at the compartmented level, meaning that individuals who knew about one aspect of the program did not know about others. The reactors themselves were not large by conventional standards, but at the depths where they operated, the heat and mechanical energy they produced had no easy avenue of escape. The surrounding rock absorbed much of this energy, but some of it, the portion that could not be thermally dissipated, expressed itself as vibration. Low-frequency vibration, slow, rhythmic, persistent, travelling upward through miles of solid rock, attenuating as it rose, growing weaker, more diffuse, less coherent, but never entirely disappearing. Mercer estimated, based on his own calculations and on readings he had access to during his time at Sandia, that these vibrations, by the time they reached the surface, would be at or just below the threshold of human perception for most people, but not for everyone. Some individuals, he noted, appeared to be significantly more sensitive to extremely low-frequency sound than the general population. These individuals would perceive the vibration not as sound in the conventional sense, but as something more visceral, a feeling in the body, a pressure in the sinuses, a disturbance in the inner ear that the brain would interpret as a low, persistent hum. This, Mercer suggested, was the Taos hum. The second layer of the problem was older than the reactors and in some ways more intractable. The Cold War had generated enormous quantities of nuclear waste, spent fuel rods, contaminated reactor materials, plutonium cores past their operational life, chemical byproducts of weapons production that were radioactive and toxic and had half-lives measured in thousands of years. The federal government had been grappling with this problem since the 1950s, and its solutions, particularly in the early decades of the weapons program, had been improvised, inconsistent, and in many cases deeply inadequate. In the desert of the American Southwest, some of this waste had been routed through Los Alamos transit corridors and placed in deep geological repositories, sites chosen for their geological stability, their remoteness from population centres, and their depth below the water table. These sites were not like the surface storage facilities that the public was aware of, not like the rusting drums at Hanford or the contaminated soil at Rocky Flats. They were deeper, more permanent, more carefully concealed. and they had an unexpected consequence that nobody had fully modelled in advance. Radioactive decay, the process by which unstable atomic nuclei release energy as they transform into more stable configurations, is not silent. At the quantum level, it is accompanied by the emission of particles and radiation, but at the macro level, in large concentrations of decaying material surrounded by dense rock and metal infrastructure, the cumulative effect of this constant energetic activity is mechanical. It generates heat, and uneven heating of surrounding materials generates stress, and stress in solid matter generates vibration. When aging plutonium cores and contaminated reactor materials were placed in deep geological vaults, reinforced with metal infrastructure, the radioactive decay of these materials interacted with the surrounding geology in ways that produced exactly the kind of low-frequency harmonic resonance that acoustic engineers were trained to recognize. The frequency profile of this resonance, based on the known decay rates of the materials involved, fell squarely within the range that had been recorded during the 1997 Taos investigation, below 40 Hz at the extreme lower edge of human auditory range. The investigators who detected this signal and flagged it for interagency review understood what they were looking at. They understood why it had been removed from the public summary. Acknowledging a low-frequency resonance emanating from 2 miles below the Taos Desert would require explaining what was down there, and what was down there was not something the Department of Energy or the Department of Defense was prepared to discuss. If you overlay 3 specific sets of data on a single map of northern New Mexico, something emerges that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The first data set is seismic. The precise locations and depth profiles of anomalous low-frequency signals detected by monitoring equipment in the region across the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. These signals cluster in a pattern that is not random. They form nodes, points of concentrated activity, connected by corridors of lower-level resonance. The second data set is geographic. The locations of federal land exclusions, restricted zones, and security-designated areas in northern New Mexico. These exclusions, some of which date back to the 1940s, others to the 1960s and 70s, define a network of protected corridors that cut across the desert in ways that make little sense in terms of surface-level features. There are no mountains or rivers that would explain their shapes. Their boundaries curve and angle in ways that suggest they were drawn around something underground rather than on the surface. The third data set is historical. The routes of weapons-related rail and highway convoys documented in partially declassified logistics records from the Cold War period. These records are incomplete, but the routes they show, the paths between Los Alamos and Kirtland and the installations in the northern desert, form a web of transit corridors whose underground equivalents would explain both the geographic exclusions and the seismic clustering. When you overlay these 3 data sets, a triangular grid emerges. Its vertices are Los Alamos National Laboratory, Kirtland Air Force Base, and a cluster of northern desert installations in the Taos region. The hum, according to every credible witness account and every acoustic measurement that has entered the partial record, aligns with this grid. It is strongest at the nodes. It diminishes along the corridors. It is essentially absent outside the triangle. A recovered memo, dated September 22, 1987, and obtained through a Freedom of Information request that took 6 years to process and produced a heavily redacted document, contains a passage that has been widely quoted among researchers who study the Taos hum. The relevant unredacted section reads, "Resonance spike exceeded structural tolerance. Civilian perception risk elevated." The memo then transitions into a section that is fully blacked out, followed by a reference to the deployment of what it calls frequency dampening arrays. The same week that this memo was dated, in late September of 1987, residents in the Taos area reported for the first time what they described as strange vibrations. Local livestock were observed behaving in disoriented ways, clustering in atypical patterns, avoiding certain areas of fields and pastures that they had previously used without issue. The Taos veterinary community noted an uptick in reports of unexplained animal distress during this period, and then, over the following weeks, the vibrations that residents had noticed diminished, not entirely, but enough that the first reports did not generate the kind of sustained concern that the 1993 outbreak would. People noticed something unusual, and then it got quieter, and life continued. The frequency dampening arrays referenced in the memo appear to have worked, at least temporarily. The public acoustic study of 1997 was not, by any rigorous scientific standard, a failure of investigation. The scientists who conducted it were skilled. Their equipment was appropriate. Their methods were sound. What they found, however, could not be publicly reported without triggering consequences that neither they nor the agencies that commissioned the study were prepared to manage. The classified notes from the investigation, fragments of which have become available through various disclosure channels over the years, contain two phrases that appear repeatedly in the marginal annotations of researchers who have reviewed the documents. The first is reactor harmonic bleed. The second is subsurface resonance amplification. These are technical terms. They describe specific physical phenomena. They are not the language of speculation or pseudoscience. They are the language of engineers who have measured something and are describing what they believe they measured. Reactor harmonic bleed refers to the phenomenon by which the mechanical and thermal output of a deep earth nuclear reactor generates vibrations that propagate upward through surrounding rock, eventually reaching the surface in attenuated form. Subsurface resonance amplification refers to the process by which certain geological formations, particularly those with layered structures of alternating density, can act as natural acoustic resonators, amplifying and sustaining vibrations that would otherwise dissipate. The classified notes suggest that both phenomena were observed during the investigation. They suggest that the investigators understood that what they were recording was not geological noise, or industrial ambient sound or psychosomatic projection. They suggest that the investigators concluded with high confidence that the Taos hum had an identifiable source, and that identifying it publicly would require disclosing the existence of active underground nuclear infrastructure that had never been officially acknowledged. The reasons for maintaining that secrecy went beyond embarrassment. Admitting to the existence of deep earth nuclear reactors beneath northern New Mexico would raise immediate questions about treaty compliance. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, and various nuclear non-proliferation agreements all contained provisions that could be interpreted as restricting the kind of subterranean nuclear activity that the existence of deep reactors would imply. It would raise questions about waste storage practices that the government had publicly characterized in ways that would be revealed as false, and it would create immediate and severe liability exposure for the communities whose residents had been suffering symptoms attributable to long-term ELF exposure for years. The investigation's public Before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to give a quick shout out to Ilwyn Eventually for suggesting this story idea. If you have ideas for future Sleep Theories episodes, conspiracy theories, unsolved mysteries, strange phenomena you think deserve a deeper look, drop them in the comments below. Some of the best stories we've covered came directly from you, and we really try and read every single suggestion. Now, let's begin. There are places on Earth that feel wrong, not dangerous, not hostile, just wrong. Devil's Tower is one of them. Rising 867 feet above the Wyoming grasslands, it dominates the landscape like a broken tooth jutting from the Earth's jaw. The Lakota people called it Matotipila, Bear Lodge. Geologists call it an igneous intrusion. Tourists call it stunning. But stand at its base as the sun sets and the temperature drops, and you'll feel something else entirely. You'll feel watched. The tower doesn't look like a mountain. Mountains have slopes, curves, the organic chaos of tectonic violence. Devil's Tower looks carved, deliberate. Its hexagonal columns rise in perfect vertical symmetry, too precise to feel accidental, too uniform to feel natural. It looks like architecture. More specifically, it looks like a stump. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally, as though some impossibly massive tree was severed at ground level, its wood petrified into stone over millennia, its roots still buried somewhere beneath the Wyoming soil. Most people dismiss this idea immediately. It's pseudoscience, geological fantasy, the fever dream of conspiracy theorists who see patterns where none exist. But here's the thing about Devil's Tower that nobody mentions in the visitor brochures. The locals don't just fear the height, they fear what happens there after dark. Park rangers enforce strict closure policies after sunset. Official explanation: safety concerns, wildlife protection, sacred site preservation. Reasonable enough, but ask anyone who's lived in the shadow of that tower for more than a decade, and they'll tell you something different. They'll tell you about the lights, the chanting, the convoys of black vehicles that arrive without announcement and leave without trace. They'll tell you about the nights when the tower hums. Some say it's a monument of stone, a geological curiosity, nothing more. Others say it's the stump of something that once touched the sky. And a very small number of people with security clearances, offshore accounts and names you'd recognise from television, say it's still alive, still growing, still waiting. This is the story of what happens when someone watches back. Chapter 1. The Man Who Worked the Night Roads. Michael Carver had lived in northeastern Wyoming his entire life. 52 years of wide skies, brutal winters, and the kind of silence that makes city people uncomfortable. He'd been born in Gillette, raised in Moorcroft, and spent the last 28 years working for the National Park Service maintaining the infrastructure roads around Devil's Tower National Monument. Night shifts mostly. He preferred them. Fewer tourists, fewer questions. Just him, his truck, the radio crackling with weather reports, and the tower standing sentinel against the stars. Michael knew every curve of State Highway 110, every pothole on the access roads, every blind turn where deer like to cross. He could drive the perimeter with his eyes closed, and sometimes on the longest nights he practically did. He'd heard all the stories, the Lakota legend of the bear clawing at the stone, leaving vertical grooves as 7 sisters escaped to the sky. The Close Encounters pilgrims who still showed up with synthesizers, trying to recreate the 5-tone sequence from the Spielberg film. The flat earthers who insisted the tower was proof of a megatree forest that once covered the planet. Michael had never believed any of it. Not the mystical interpretations, not the alien theories, not the giant tree hypothesis. He was a practical man. He fixed roads. He cleared rockfall. He filed reports in triplicate and went home to a 1-bedroom house with a dog named Rusty and a television that got 4 channels on a good day. Devil's Tower was just a rock, an impressive rock, a beautiful rock, but still just a rock. That certainty lasted until October 17th, the night everything changed. Chapter 2. The Unscheduled Closure. It started with an email. Michael was finishing his second cup of coffee when the notification buzzed on his phone. 7:45 p.m, 15 minutes before his shift began. The subject line read, Immediate, Road Closure Directive, DTM-0-9-13. He opened it. Effective 1800 hours, October 17th, All access roads to Devil's Tower National Monument are closed for emergency geological surveying. Duration, 12 hours. All non-essential personnel are to vacate the area. Park enforcement will verify compliance. No exceptions. It was signed by someone Michael didn't recognise. No name, just a title. Regional Infrastructure Coordinator, Emergency Operations. Michael frowned. He'd been doing this job for nearly 3 decades. He knew every survey team, every seasonal closure, every maintenance window scheduled months in advance. Geological surveying didn't happen overnight. It required permits, equipment manifests, environmental impact assessments. And it definitely didn't happen in October. Survey teams worked in spring and summer when the ground was stable and the weather predictable. Fall in Wyoming was unpredictable. Early snow, freezing rain, winds that could knock a vehicle off the road. Michael checked the park's internal scheduling system. No survey teams logged, no equipment rentals approved, no geological consultants contracted. He called his supervisor. Voicemail. He called the park ranger station. Voicemail. He called the regional office in Denver. The line rang 8 times before a woman answered, sounding harried. "This is Carver. Night maintenance at Devil's Tower. I got a closure notice for tonight, but there's nothing in the system. Can you—" "The closure is authorised," she interrupted. "Follow the directive." "Who authorised it?" "I don't have that information." "What survey team is—" "I don't have that information either. The directive is valid. Comply or file an incident report." She hung up. Michael sat in his truck, engine idling, staring at the email on his phone. Something was wrong. In 28 years, he'd never seen a closure order issued with 0 notice, 0 explanation, and 0 paper trail. The Park Service was a bureaucracy. Everything had a paper trail. Everything except this. He should have driven home. He should have cracked open a beer, watched television, let someone else worry about mysterious closure orders. But Michael Carver had spent his entire life in the shadow of Devil's Tower, and he'd never, not once, felt curious about what happened there after dark. Until now. He put the truck in gear and headed toward the outer perimeter. Chapter 3. The Ring of 12. Michael parked on a ridge 3 miles northwest of the tower. It was a maintenance access point, technically within the monument's boundaries, but far enough from the main roads that nobody ever bothered with it. He'd used it 100 times to check remote culverts and drainage systems. From here you could see the tower's western face silhouetted against the night sky like a broken pillar holding up the stars. He killed the engine and waited. 9:37 p.m. The monument grounds were completely dark. No visitor centre lights, no parking lot floods, no security perimeter illumination, just darkness. And then light, not sudden, not bright, just there. Michael grabbed his binoculars. 12 lights, evenly spaced, arranged in a perfect circle around the tower's base. Not headlights, too stationary, not flashlights, too steady, they looked like torches. No, not torches. The light was too white, too clean. LED floods, maybe, or halogen lamps on portable stands. But why 12? Why arranged in perfect geometric precision? Michael counted again. 12. Exactly 12. He checked his watch. 9:41 p.m. He scanned the access roads with his binoculars. No vehicles, no movement. Where had the lights come from? He swept back to the tower. The lights remained, perfectly still, perfectly spaced. And then he saw the first vehicle. Chapter 4. The arrival. It came from the south, headlights off, moving slowly along the main access road. A black SUV. Cadillac Escalade, maybe. Hard to tell in the darkness. It stopped near the base of the tower just outside the ring of lights. Doors opened. 4 figures emerged, dressed in dark clothing. They moved with the precise coordination of security personnel scanning the perimeter, checking sight lines, establishing positions. Then the second vehicle arrived. Another black SUV, same make, same slow approach. Then a third, fourth, fifth. Michael counted 11 vehicles in total, all identical, all unmarked, all arriving within 20 minutes. No park permits had been filed. No special event licenses issued. No documentation whatsoever. The figures from the vehicles began unloading equipment. Not geological surveying tools, not scientific instruments, portable generators, audio equipment. What looked like ceremonial stands or altars. Michael's hands were shaking as he adjusted the binoculars. The passengers began emerging from the later vehicles, and that's when he started recognising faces. The first was a woman he'd seen on television 100 times, a tech CEO whose company had recently absorbed 3 competitors and whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations. She stepped out of the third SUV wearing a long dark coat, her face illuminated briefly by interior lights. The second was a senator. Michael couldn't remember which state, but he recognised the silver hair, the sharp features, the way cameras loved that face during election cycles. The third was an actor, Academy Award winner, known for playing heroes in action films and philanthropists in prestige dramas. The fourth was a media mogul whose news network shaped global narratives. The fifth was a tech entrepreneur whose social media platform had replaced town squares and public discourse. One by one they emerged. Billionaires, politicians, cultural icons, people whose names appeared in Forbes lists and Time magazine covers. People who supposedly had nothing in common except wealth and influence, and yet here they were, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, walking toward Devil's Tower like pilgrims approaching a shrine. Michael felt his pulse hammering in his throat. This wasn't a survey team. This was something else entirely. Chapter 5. The Path of Torches. The security. Personnel had been busy. From his vantage point, Michael could see a temporary pathway leading from the parking area toward the base of the tower. It was lined with torches, real flames this time, not electric lights, casting flickering orange light across the pale stone. The path wound through the boulder field, carefully navigating the uneven terrain, ending at a flat area directly beneath the tower's western face. The attendees began walking, slowly, silently. Michael counted 23 people in total. Some he recognised, most he didn't, but all of them moved with the same deliberate purpose, the same ritualistic precision. And then he noticed what they were wearing. Over their expensive coats and tailored suits, they donned ceremonial robes, dark fabric, floor-length, hooded. As they walked, the robes caught the torchlight, revealing embroidered symbols, inverted pentagrams, tree sigils, massive trunks with roots spreading like veins, runic shapes Michael didn't recognise, but which felt ancient, pre-Christian, older than language itself. One woman, a banking executive whose face Michael had seen in financial news segments, carried a portable altar. It was small, maybe 2 feet across, carved from dark wood and covered in more symbols. A man, possibly a diplomat based on his bearing, carried what looked like a ceremonial staff. It was wrapped in leather and topped with something that caught the firelight wrong, like polished obsidian or volcanic glass. They weren't tourists. They weren't scientists. They were worshippers, and Devil's Tower wasn't a monument. It was their temple. Michael's mind raced back to the stories he'd dismissed for decades, the giant tree theory. It had always seemed absurd. The idea that Devil's Tower wasn't a volcanic intrusion but a petrified stump from an ancient megaforest. That Earth had once been covered in trees so massive they made modern redwoods look like saplings. That some prehistoric cataclysm had felled them, all, leaving only scattered stumps like Devil's Tower, Shiprock in New Mexico, and similar formations worldwide. Pseudoscience, geology deniers, conspiracy nonsense. But watching these people approach the tower in ritual formation, watching them treat it like something sacred, something alive, what if they knew something the rest of the world didn't? What if Devil's Tower wasn't dead stone? What if it was dormant? Chapter 6. The Frequency of Silence. The chanting began at 10:17 p.m. Michael heard it before he saw the source, a low resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground beneath his truck, rattling the windows, settling into his chest like a second heartbeat. It wasn't singing, it wasn't speaking, It was something between the two, a vocalization that felt older than words, structured yet alien, harmonic yet mechanical. Through the binoculars, he watched the robed figures form a circle around the tower's base. They stood, perfectly still, heads slightly bowed, hands raised to chest height, palms facing inward. The chant continued. No visible conductor, no rhythm section, no leader keeping time. And yet they were perfectly synchronized. The sound had texture, layers. It felt less like music and more like machinery, like the resonance of a massive engine idling deep underground, its vibrations surfacing through stone and soil. Michael had worked around heavy equipment his entire career. He knew the feel of generators, the hum of transformers, the grinding of hydraulic systems. This was different. This felt intentional, designed. And then he noticed the silence. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant highway noise, usually a constant whisper on Wyoming nights, had vanished. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Michael scanned the area with his binoculars. The grassland surrounding the tower was normally alive with nocturnal activity, deer grazing, coyotes prowling, bats hunting insects beneath the stars. Nothing moved, not a single animal, not a single bird. Even the insects, the ubiquitous moths and beetles that swarmed around any light source, were gone. The only living things in the entire landscape were the 23 people standing in a circle, chanting in a language Michael didn't recognize, worshipping a tower that shouldn't exist. And then the tower responded. Chapter 7. The Stone That Remembers. It started as a vibration. Michael felt it through the truck's frame, a low-frequency tremor that made the steering wheel buzz beneath his white-knuckled grip. At first, he thought it was an earthquake. Wyoming got them occasionally, minor tremors from the Yellowstone caldera or distant fault line adjustments. But this was different. This was rhythmic, pulsing in time with the chanting. Through the binoculars, he watched the tower itself, the hexagonal columns, those perfect vertical striations that geologists attributed to cooling. Basalt seemed to shimmer in the torchlight, not from heat distortion, not from atmospheric interference. They were pulsing, subtle, barely perceptible, but undeniable, as if the stone was breathing. Michael's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Resonance effects from the chanting, acoustic phenomena amplified by the tower's unique structure, infrasound frequencies causing visual distortions. But his instincts, the part of him that had survived 52 Wyoming winters by trusting his gut, knew better. The tower was reacting. He could feel heat now, even from 3 miles away. Not the ambient warmth of bodies and torches, something deeper, something radiating outward from the stone itself, warming the October air, creating convection currents that made the stars ripple overhead. Michael thought about basalt, about igneous rock, about the geological formation story he'd heard 1,000 times. 60 million years ago, magma pushed up through sedimentary layers but never reached the surface. It cooled slowly underground, forming crystalline columns. Over millennia, erosion removed the softer surrounding rock, leaving the harder basalt tower exposed. A perfectly reasonable explanation. Except, what if the tower wasn't basalt? What if it was wood? Petrified over epochs, compressed, mineralized, transformed from organic to mineral while retaining the fundamental structure, the vertical grain, the hexagonal cells, the internal channels that once carried water and nutrients from roots to canopy. What if Devil's Tower was exactly what it looked like? A stump, the severed base of a tree so massive it defied comprehension. And if that were true, if the tower was fossilized wood instead of cooled magma, then the next question became unavoidable. Could petrified wood still conduct energy? Could it still remember being alive? Michael watched the robed figures continue their chant, watched the tower pulse in response, and felt the answer settling into his bones like winter cold. Yes. Chapter 8. The Platform of Rings. At 10:41 p.m. the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the vibration ceased, leaving only the whisper of Michael's own breathing and the tick of cooling metal in the truck's engine. The robed figures remained motionless for exactly 60 seconds. Then they began to move. The security personnel brought forward a circular platform, maybe 20 feet in diameter, constructed from what looked like dark metal or composite material. It took 6 people to carry it, moving with the strained precision of pallbearers. They set it down at the tower's base, directly centred beneath the western face. Michael adjusted his binoculars, increasing magnification despite the growing shake in his hands. The platform's surface was covered in carved symbols, concentric circles like tree rings, but not random, not organic. These were perfect, mathematical, spiralling inward toward a central point with geometric precision that made Michael's eyes hurt to follow. Between the rings, more symbols, runes, glyphs, characters from alphabets Michael didn't recognise. Some looked vaguely Scandinavian, others resembled Sanskrit or ancient Sumerian. A few seemed completely alien, angles that shouldn't fit together, curves that defied Euclidean geometry. The platform wasn't just decorative, it was functional. A map, a key, a diagram of something vast and complex. The robed figures formed a circle around it, leaving the centre empty. Then the altar arrived. Chapter 9. The Obsidian Offering. 8 people carried it. A massive slab of polished obsidian, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, supported by an ornate metal frame. Even from 3 miles away, Michael could see how the volcanic glass caught the torchlight, reflecting it, refracting it, seeming to absorb and emit light simultaneously. They placed it at the platform's centre, directly over the convergence point of all the carved rings. The altar's surface wasn't smooth. It was covered in objects, fragments of fossilised wood, ranging from thumbnail-sized splinters to pieces as large as a human forearm. The wood had the distinctive texture of petrification, mineralised, heavy, transformed from carbon to silica over incomprehensible time. Bone relics, not modern, not recent. These were ancient, yellowed, partially fossilised, worked into shapes that might have been tools or ceremonial objects. Michael couldn't tell from this distance, but something about their arrangement felt deliberate, sacred, metallic artefacts, strange alloys that didn't match any metal Michael recognised. They had a greenish patina, like old copper, but the shapes were wrong. Too angular, too precise, too manufactured. One of the robed figures stepped forward. Michael recognised the bearing, if not the face. Someone used to authority, to command, to being obeyed without question. This person wore a different robe, while the others were plain dark fabric. This one was embroidered with gold thread forming an intricate tree pattern. The tree's trunk was straight and massive. Its roots spread across the robe's hem like underground rivers. Its branches reached toward the shoulders, each one ending in symbols that might have been stars or fruits or watchful eyes. But it was the mask that made Michael's breath catch. The figure wore a ceremonial mask carved from dark wood, depicting a horned entity that was neither fully human nor fully animal. The face was elongated, almost skull-like. The horns curved upward and backward like those of a ram or ancient forest deity. The eyes were hollow sockets, creating the unsettling impression that something behind the mask was looking out. This was the leader, the one who would speak for all of them, the one who would address whatever they believed lived beneath Devil's Tower. The masked figure raised both arms, the chanting resumed, but this time Michael could make out individual words, or what might have been words, fragmented through distortion and distance and his own pounding heartbeat. He pulled out his phone, started recording. The audio quality would be terrible, but maybe, if he survived this, if he didn't disappear like so many conspiracy theorists who got too close to uncomfortable truths, maybe someone could analyse it, translate it, confirm what he was hearing. The chant had structure now. Call and response. The masked leader would vocalize a phrase and the circle would echo it back, their voices layered and harmonic. Michael caught fragments. He who was cut shall rise again. The root still drinks. Beneath the earth, blood and bone and breath, to the rooted one. The rooted one, not a god of the sky, not a deity of heaven or light or transcendent salvation, a god of roots, of depth, of things buried and patient and very, very old. Michael's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the binoculars steady. These people, billionaires and politicians and cultural elites, weren't just performing theatre. They weren't playing at mysticism or engaging in rich people eccentricity. They believed. They believed Devil's Tower wasn't a stump. They believed it was a severed limb of something planetary, something that predated human civilization, something that had been cut down in an ancient war or cataclysm or act of cosmic violence, and they believed its roots were still alive, still drinking, still waiting to grow again. Chapter 10. The sky turns inward. At 11:03 p.m. the clouds began to move. Michael had been watching the sky peripherally, keeping most of his attention on the ritual below. But movement overhead pulled his gaze upward. The clouds were spiralling, not scudding along on wind currents, not dissipating or forming through normal meteorological processes, spiralling, rotating slowly around a central point directly above Devil's Tower like water circling, a drain. Michael had lived in Wyoming long enough to recognise every weather pattern, every atmospheric phenomenon. He'd seen mammatus clouds and lenticular formations and virga, and every variation of prairie storm system. This was none of those things. This was deliberate. The spiral tightened, clouds compressing toward the tower's summit, creating a vortex that seemed to pull down instead of up, as if the sky itself was being drawn toward the stone. And then the stars began to shift, subtle at first, just a slight displacement, like heat shimmer distorting distant lights, but it intensified. Constellations Michael had known since childhood, Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, seemed to bend around the vortex above the tower, their positions warping, their familiar patterns dissolving into geometric chaos. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. The masked leader's voice rose above the others, no longer calling and waiting for response, but driving forward in a continuous stream of syllables that might have been language or might have been something older than language. Pure intention vocalized into sound. And from the summit of Devil's Tower, something began to emerge. A light. Not bright, not blinding. Dim red, barely visible. Like the glow of distant coals or the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures. But it wasn't shining upward from the stone. It was being pulled downward from the sky. Michael watched, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were reporting. The red light descended from the spiral of clouds like a thread being drawn through a needle's eye. It touched the tower's summit and seemed to sink into the stone, absorbed immediately, leaving only the faintest afterglow. Then it happened again. Another thread of red light drawn down from the sky, absorbed into the tower. Then another. The tower was drinking light, pulling it from the heavens, feeding on it. Michael thought about trees, about photosynthesis, about the way plants draw energy from sunlight, converting electromagnetic radiation into chemical fuel through processes so complex that scientists still didn't fully understand them. What if Devil's Tower was doing the same thing? What if the ritual had awakened some ancient mechanism, some petrified biological process that still functioned despite millions of years of mineralization? What if the tower could still eat? The thought sent ice through Michael's veins. If it could eat light, what else could it consume? Chapter 11. The faces in firelight. The ritual was intensifying. The robed figures had begun moving around the platform, not walking but swaying, their bodies undulating in time with the chanting, creating waves of motion that rippled around the circle like wind through grass. And in their fervour the robes began to open. Michael watched through the binoculars as expensive fabric fell away, revealing the people beneath. He recognized more faces now, a former president, not recent, not controversial. The kind of elder statesman who appeared at charity events and received lifetime achievement awards and was universally praised for their wisdom and service. Kneeling before an obsidian altar, chanting to something beneath the earth. A tech CEO whose company dominated global communications infrastructure, whose algorithms determined what billions of people saw, heard, believed, swaying in ritual ecstasy, eyes closed, completely surrendered. A media personality known for warmth and relatability, whose morning show attracted 20 million viewers, whose book club selections became instant bestsellers, whose endorsement could make or break careers, arms raised, chanting in a language she definitely hadn't learned at her Ivy League university. A banking executive whose decisions influenced global markets, whose firm had survived multiple financial crises, whose name appeared on the boards of dozens of major corporations, prostrate on the ground, forehead pressed to stone, worshipping. These weren't marginal figures, not fringe celebrities or has-been politicians clinging to relevance. These were the people who shaped the world, who determined policy, who controlled information flow, who decided what was true and what was dismissed as conspiracy. And they were all here, in the middle of nowhere, treating a Wyoming rock formation like a living god. Michael felt his understanding of reality fracturing. He'd spent his entire life operating under certain assumptions, that the world worked according to knowable laws, that powerful people were rational actors, that mysticism and superstition were relics of pre-scientific thinking. But watching a former head of state kneel before Devil's Tower, watching billionaires chant in dead languages, watching cultural icons treat petrified stone like a deity, either they were all insane, or they knew something the rest of humanity didn't. The chanting reached a crescendo. The masked leader stepped onto the platform approaching the obsidian altar, raising both arms toward the tower's summit. And Michael heard words he could actually understand. The covenant remains. The root remembers, blood for depth, bone for strength, breath for the one who waits. The circle responded in unison. He who was cut shall rise again. Then silence, absolute and terrible. Even the vibration stopped. The red light ceased descending from the sky. The clouds stilled in their spiral pattern. Everything waited. And Michael realized with horrifying clarity, the ritual was reaching its climax. The moment of offering had arrived. Chapter 12. The Container. Two security personnel approached the platform carrying a sealed container. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, made from what looked like brushed steel or titanium. No visible seams, no obvious lid, just a perfectly smooth metal cube that reflected torchlight like a mirror. They set it before the masked leader and stepped back. The leader touched the container's surface. Michael couldn't see exactly what happened next. The angle was wrong, the distance too great, but the container opened. No hinges, no latches. It simply divided, separating along invisible seams to reveal something inside. The leader reached in and removed an object. Michael strained against the binocular's maximum magnification, trying to see what it was. Small, organic, irregular shape. A heart? No. Too small for human, too large for animal. A plant? A root? Maybe. The leader held it up, displaying it to the circle. The chanting resumed.